it is almost a destruction of the sexual imagination. It is, a sexual imagination that's shaped by a company, by an organization that, does not have your own moral or intellectual or sexual benefit at heart. They want to make money.
A listener wrote in about a reference that I made on this show about C.S. Lewis's letters, dealing with this recurrent problem of people saying, I don't know if I'm really a believer. I don't know what my state is with God, and his attempting to reassure them through that. Also, though, in those letters were a lot of counsel and spiritual direction for people who were grappling with the mid 20th century version of porn. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And what I have found in my experience is that often these two things are connected, especially it seems when I'm talking to a young man who is saying to me, I don't know where I am spiritually. I don't know where I stand with God. Maybe 8 times out of 10, it ends up being a conversation about porn. And what I want to talk about today is about the way that pornography is not just shaping individuals, but might be shaping our entire ecosystem culturally, and what, if anything, we can do about that. So if you're listening to this, taking your kids to soccer practice, or if you're listening to this with your grandma in the room somewhere and you want to skip it or move to the headphones or something else, that's a warning to do that, because we're going to be talking about some pretty heavy things. And the reason I wanted to have this conversation today is I read an amazing op-ed in the New York Times by our guest today, Christine Emba, on something that very few people even address at all, and that is the question of pornography. She also has a book about the broader questions of sexuality and gender, masculinity, femininity, all of those kinds of things. Christine Emba, she's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and she works on these issues of gender and sexuality and youth culture and social norms. She's also a contributing writer at the New York Times, and she has written before for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and her book is called Rethinking Sex, A Provocation. The essay that I want to talk about today also is The Delusion of Porn's Harmlessness. And that has really been a conversation starting sort of essay. Christine, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, especially on a topic like this.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic for a lot of people to talk about, I think, regardless of sort of where they are in in the spectrum of this. It's something that seems to be everywhere, but very few people are addressing. You talk about in this essay, and you talk about more broadly in your book, how porn is not just something people watch. I think it's the assumption that people have is there are these desires. Porn is the means of meeting those desires. But your argument is that porn actually shapes what people want. How is that the case? How does that work?
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky subject. It's one that, no one really wants to delve into that much because it touches all sorts of sensitivities around who we are as people and what our preferences are and what we're allowed to like or not like. Even myself, I didn't sort of mean to make this one of my sort of subject matters, but
Mm-hmm.
it seemed important. So here we are. But yeah, when I write about pornography and think about pornography, um, part of what worries me about its prevalence, is not just that it is something that we watch. We watch a lot of things. Honestly, we should all probably be watching a lot less and reading
Mm-hmm.
more. But also we have to understand that what we watch, what we consume, changes who we are. in many different ways. So, I mean, just thinking about, you know, watching a basic TV show, not even pornography, or watching a commercial, you see something, it it appears appealing to you. You may want to mimic what you see, or what you see is just memorable. It kind of sticks in your brain. You have like a jingle from a commercial that just like
Hmm.
sticks in your brain and sort of shapes how you think about other things. And that's just sort of like normal watching, kind of anything that we come across in the world. But then you think about pornography. First of all, pornography does engage sort of our sexual instinct, our our deepest, or one of our deepest desires, and one of our sort of most intense pleasure centers. There are different ways that you can kind of imprint things in your mind, right? You can watch something and it's interesting, that's fine. You can watch something and it engages you emotionally, and then it sticks longer. You watch something like pornography that is, in its resolution for many people tied to sort of one of the most intense, yeah, pleasurable feelings that someone can have, like that that sticks in your mind. And yet what people are seeing in pornography is often, I mean, not even often, basically always false. Pornography is not real sex. It is not about real relationships. It does not even attempt to show real love and real respect for the other person. We're consuming other people's bodies in pornography, basically. And when we think about the pornography that is, popular today, that is influencing the minds of young people who are often exposed to pornography much, much younger than you would think. I think the average age of first exposure is between 13 and 15. And, for some unlucky kids, it's as young as, 10. Um, what they're seeing is often their first introduction to sex, what the relationship between men and women, adults, is. And what they're seeing in sort of modern pornography is often a really violent and ugly representation of that. Choking, slapping, hitting, people using vile language, women being treated as objects to be abused. And so they come away with like that concept sort of shaping their mind, shaping their image of sexuality, shaping their image of what women do and what men do. And that is not a good thing to be shaping yourself on.
How is it, let's put to the side for right now, we'll come back to it, some of these more extreme kind of violent and abusive sorts of porn. But how is it different? I mean, I mentioned those C.S. Lewis letters, often to men who were dealing with kind of trying to speak euphemistically here, sort of a solo expression of sexuality that is not directed toward other people, put it that way. How how is porn different from just the common sort of struggle with imagination and inward direction of sexual impulses that's always been there? Is it just a different technological means, or is this time actually different?
Interesting. And I'd love to hear what you think about this as a man, because, when we think about sort of uh, what the different genders seem to be attracted to, kind of porn for women or pornography for women often is sort of romance novels,
Hmm.
or, spicy fiction,
Yeah.
even like auditory stories, whereas for men, it is visual. Um, I think that one thing that is different in the use of pornography is that, first of all, the way that pornography is consumed today, on what are known as tube sites on the internet, you go to YouPorn or wherever you go, is that it's extremely visual. And these visuals arrive sort of classified and pre-packaged for your consumption. So, you're fed kind of the categories that you're assumed to like or supposed to like. And so that shapes your imagination. Your imagination is already channeled, in certain directions. Click here for blonde people, click here for, younger women, click here for something else. So, in a sense, in a really kind of sad sense, actually, it is almost a destruction of the sexual imagination. It is, a sexual imagination that's shaped by a company, by an organization that, does not have your own moral or intellectual or sexual benefit at heart. They want to make money. And then when you think about consuming, pornography, images of other people, as opposed to, yes, the struggle that I think everyone has with self-regulation, um, I think we have to acknowledge that pornography isn't victimless. It isn't just sort of like something that comes into being and like floats onto the internet. There are real people involved. There are real women and men involved in making these productions. And what we know of the pornography industry, although, some will protest that, of course, there's ethical porn somewhere, is that often, these performers are not being treated well. The conditions are poor. And to engage with pornography, kind of knowing that, you're choosing to say that these people are objects for my consumption, and whatever is happening to them is worth it because I get to have what I want. So in a sense, it's teaching you to objectify, to see women as something on a stream or something on a screen that are there for my pleasure, for my consumption and for my use. And I think that that is behavior, that sort of understanding of what women are for can spill out into real life and into real interactions with other people. And of course, there's always, the protest, right? That like, well, it's just pornography. It's just something I'm watching. It's nothing. Like it doesn't have anything to do with my real life. But we know that's not how people work. We know
Mm-hmm.
that we don't have these like totally high barriers between like, well, this thing I watched has no bearing on the impact, has no impact on anything else. Like this thing that I engage in doesn't touch anything else. Our lives aren't like that. Our brains aren't wired like that, and our souls are not wired like that. We're affected by what we take in and by sort of the messages and the understandings that we imbibe in doing so.
Do you think it's appropriate to use the language? There's a lot of debate about this, the language of addiction as it applies to pornography. Is that the right category?
Yeah, that's a really kind of controversial question, actually, in these spaces, because most would say that the people who use the language of pornography addiction are often coming from Christian or faith backgrounds,
Hmm.
whereas it's like sort of not as common for people in kind of more secular spaces to claim that they have or are worried about pornography addiction. But I tend to think of addiction as, you know, there's like the scientific understanding of addiction as something that you can't control, a sort of disease that's affecting your life in a negative way. And I think there are people who would say that they can no longer control how much pornography that they consume, and that they feel sort of withdrawal when they stop using it, and their consumption has affected their lives in a negative way. Um, and so if they want to use the term addiction to describe that, I think that's perfectly fair. I think that there's also a push against saying, porn addiction exists, because then that would suggest that porn is bad
Hmm.
or porn is something that should be regulated. Maybe porn is something that shouldn't be on the normal marketplace. And there are a lot of people invested in not, yeah,
It could also work the other way too, with sort of putting it into a therapeutic category that says, "What can I do?"
right.
I'm sort of powerless before this, the way I would be before cocaine or something along those lines. It could
Yeah,
work. It would
true.
work either way. There was a book a couple of years ago um, that was doing social science research on these questions and saying that really the measurable sort of psychological harm behind pornography was not the porn itself. it was with religious people who are dealing with feelings of guilt and shame
Hmm.
after consuming porn. How do you view that sort of assertion? That it's not the problem is not with people who sort of freely understand I'm a sexual person, I'm consuming this stuff. It's with the people who think they're doing something wrong and feel ashamed by it.
Well, so I think I have a comparatively countercultural view
Mhm.
among kind of people my age
Yeah.
and in many of the circles that I run in, where I think that shame and guilt are okay.
Mm,
And in fact, sometimes good. Um, Guilt is when you know that you have done something that you shouldn't have done, that you've done something wrong, and you feel bad about it. Shame is a little bit more difficult because shame tends to be sort of inward directed. It's not just guilt, I did something wrong and I feel bad about it. Shame is, me feeling like I'm a bad person. There is something wrong with me. And in our modern society, there is a real pushback against guilt and shame. We don't want to make people feel guilty. We don't want to make people feel bad about themselves. Everyone should feel free to be, whoever they want to be and unashamed. Um, but I actually happen to believe that there are some behaviors that are bad,
mhm,
some desires that are not good, that will make your life worse, and that if you indulge in them, or if you find yourself indulging in them and you feel guilty about it, maybe that's actually a sign that you should stop doing that, or
mhm,
that something has gone wrong. Um, so it's possible that maybe people of faith or people from religious backgrounds have a stronger or a clear mental understanding that porn is a bad thing, and therefore they feel guilty about using porn, or they feel ashamed for watching pornography. um, and that presents itself as psychological turmoil.
mhm.
And to that I kind of say, like, well, I don't think that porn is good for you. I
Yeah.
don't think it's good for society. I don't think that you should be indulging in it. And if you feel bad that you are, maybe that's a sign that you should stop, and that's okay. That's sort of your conscience responding to something.
Have you seen people who have been sort of deeply embedded in porn consumption who don't like it? I mean, and that's when I'm sort of talking to people, it's very rare. Maybe it's just because of the kind of people who are going to come and talk to me about this. It's almost never the case that someone says, I've decided that pornography is a good thing and I'm going to look for it. It's almost always people who are saying, I don't like consuming this stuff. And when I'm in my sort of right mind, I see it as repellent for all the reasons that you're talking about societally, personally, every way else, spiritually. But they find themselves continuing to sort of retreat into these patterns. Have you seen situations where people have been able to kind of come out of that and redirect themselves? And if so, what works to do that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I should say, first of all, that I don't like counsel people on
Yeah.
pornography. Really, this is a subject I write about, but I've interviewed a number of people about sort of their relationships to sex and to pornography, both for my book, Rethinking Sex, and in research for writing this piece and others. Um, and there are a couple of stories that stick out to me that don't seem actually that uncommon. Um, in Rethinking Sex, I wrote about a young guy who I interviewed who talked about how he went to study at a different campus. He didn't know anybody. It was sort of like a self-directed study program. He was really bored and lonely, and he started watching a lot of porn. Um, but he also like wanted to be in a relationship. He wanted to eventually get married, and he met someone. And he met this girl who he really liked, but he struggled because he found that like he couldn't be attracted to her.
Mm,
And he realized that like he couldn't be attracted to her because she didn't resemble what he saw in porn,
mm,
you know, all the time that he was watching. His sort of like his sexual self was attracted to this whole other thing, and like a live woman with flaws and conversations was not aligned with what he was watching every night.
yeah.
Um, and he realized that this sucked, actually, that he really liked this person and wanted to be with them. And it was crazy that he had like trained himself out of being able to like a real woman.
Hmm.
Um, and so the solution for him was just cutting out porn entirely and trying to reframe, sort of reset his understanding of attraction, to sort of like relearn how to be attracted to real women,
Mm,
including this woman who was in front of him who he really liked. um, and it worked out for him. Actually, he is now married and has a
hmm.
baby on the way, which is delightful.
Mm,
um, but I think at first the first step is just sort of like recognizing, you know, what porn might be keeping you from. You know, one of the things that's like discussed a lot, I know you've talked about it, is sort of like the crisis of men, or the male
hmm.
loneliness crisis, or men, you know, not entering into relationships, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and I have to say, I think that porn is probably a big part of this, because porn is really easy to access. It doesn't ask anything of you. It's always there. Whereas to like be in a relationship, to go out and meet somebody, to go on a
Yeah.
date, you have to like take a shower, get
Hmm.
dressed, you know, go outside, talk to someone who might turn you down, and then you'd have to find someone else who might also turn you down until you know, find a real person who you connect with. And that is a lot of work. And it's easy to kind of sink into the sort of like, well, porn isn't asking this of me. It's probably not as great, but it'll do. And I think that for a lot of men, there I worry about a lot of men, especially young men, getting trapped in this space of like, it's not great, but it's sufficient,
Yeah.
and that keeping them from going further.
I remember sort of the moment, I don't mean the literal moment, but the kind of the moment in time when, in doing pastoral counseling with people, I started to see this big shift of sexless marriages that were not the typical pattern of older people who are sort of hormonally slowing down, but young married couples who were in sexless marriages. And in almost every case, the reason was the man. And when I would talk to them, almost always porn is there in some way or the other.
Wow.
And the thing that I thought was interesting is the language that most of these men used when they're trying to describe why they didn't want to have sex with their wives is awkward. It just seems and feels awkward. And what
Huh.
you realize in talking to them is that the barrier was actual intimacy. It seemed too intense, kind of emotionally, where porn is not that way. It really is just consumption. And I wonder if, when you're looking at these numbers, I mean, if you see the data about sort of teenage and adolescent sexual activity, if you had seen numbers that low, sort of prospectively 30 years ago, somebody would have said, oh, well, there's been a comeback of social conservatism and so forth, without asking the question, okay, why are so few people having sex? And it's not because of moral constraints. Usually, it's because they don't have the ability to do this because they don't have these relationships. Is is porn a symptom of something that's going on, or is that a cause of this kind of sexual deadening that we see around us?
Hmm. That's a complicated question. I mean, I think Kate Julian of The Atlantic wrote an article about, the sex recession,
Hmm.
um, that I think came out in maybe 2018. It came out a while ago, noting that,
Pre-pandemic.
yeah,
Yeah.
pre-pandemic, that people were sort of getting together less. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, and that definitely did not
Yeah.
help people form relationships. But, I honestly think that we're only beginning to reckon with the impact that the pandemic has had on young people, and also that shifts in technology have had on young people. The pandemic made it harder for young people to go out on dates, to connect one on one, and especially for this swath of people who were really of like the age in which you learn to do that, the age in which you learn to get dressed, to go outside, to ask someone on a date. And the Me Too moment also happened right before that, which added more like kind of stress to the situation. I think made some men at least a lot more nervous and cautious about interacting with women. Um, and all of this, I think, combined to make at least a generation um, just kind of much more awkward and unsure about how to interact with the opposite sex, and also much more reliant on technology, on the
Mm.
internet for everything, for communication, for dating. Dating apps, blew up during the pandemic, although they were already, increasing, picking up steam before then. So, kind of all of these interactions went virtual, and porn was there.
Mm.
Porn was online. During the pandemic, you couldn't necessarily like go out and see someone or meet a girl or do anything, but porn was there. And I suspect that there was a moment, or, more than one moment, but I suspect that this period of like sort of a rapid internetization, um, where porn became much more of a fixture in young people's lives than it had been before. So I do think that that's a contributor. Um, I also think that, just younger generations have grown up, pandemic aside, with porn in their pockets, literally, in terms of, smartphone access. It's no longer like you had to go out of your way to find your uncle's old Playboy or something in the woods,
Hmm.
or even like go to a store and buy something. It's just always there. And it sort of permeates the internet and, the way that they observe and absorb life. Um, and all those distracting features that porn has that we just talked about, its ease, its lack of awkwardness, um, are very present. And in a time of sort of instant consumption and a time in which we desire for our desires to be fulfilled with as little friction as possible, you know, porn is a great substitute for the friction of relationships, the friction of being with other people. So, yeah, I do think that it has contributed to sort of a slowing down in relationship formation. And I think also not just for men, um, but on the side of women, when I speak to young women and talk to them about, their sexual experiences and their dating experiences, one thing that I hear a lot from young women is that like the men who they run into are often what they describe as porn addled, you
Mm.
know, um, and that's not attractive to them. It's like, oh yeah, like I went to, you know, I was texting with this guy and then he like immediately started saying like really wild and gross things to me over text. Like I didn't find that attractive. I don't want to be with a person like that.
Hmm.
Or, I slept with this person and he like immediately tried some sort of like crazy rough action on me, he choked me by surprise, which has
Hmm.
become shockingly common over the past couple of years and is definitely coming from pornography. And women are just like, I don't want to deal with that. Like that, a landscape in which men behave towards me in the way that men behave in pornography is actually terrifying. And so I'd rather just not engage. I'm not going to be in a relationship. I'm not going to date if that's what's out there. So I think it pushes people away on both ends.
How does a person know? I mean, if you think about the way that we're all shaped and formed socially, culturally, sorts of questions we ask, the sorts of things that we think are normal as opposed to abnormal, how would a how would a young person know, wait, I'm in a relationship, I'm in a situation that is not the way it ought to be, other than just a sense of, sometimes you'll have people who will say, I just have a sense that something's not right. But what are the sorts of things that a person should look for to say I'm in a healthy rather than an unhealthy sort of potential dating relationship here, or something like that?
Yeah. Um, I mean, first of all, I think this sounds simplistic, but it's not. Does the person you're with treat you like a person?
Mm.
Not like an object, not like someone who's there to sort of like cater to their desires, um, or who they're like clearly just trying to get to know to use for some other person. But are they interested in you as a person, your desires, your thoughts? Do they make space for you and what you like and care about in your sensitivities? Are you treated sensitively? Are you treated well? Um, I think another thing to be mindful of is like, there is a Christian sexual ethic
Hmm.
that says that sex is better is left for marriage, that one waits to have sex, and I think that's it's pretty uncommon in this day and age. I think, unfortunately, and this is something that I think about a lot, um, our social norms have changed just super rapidly
Yeah.
over the past several decades. This is actually I'm working on a in the very early stages of a book project talking about these social norm questions. And one of the things that I feel very sad about and that I wonder if we could bring back is simply mentorship from older people who
Yeah.
understand what the norms were and what they used to be. Because it's hard if you're a college student or a teenager. You want to turn around and like ask your friends, like, is this okay, like, is this normal, is this person treating me well? But like they don't know anything either, they're the same age as you
Hmm.
are. um, and so I really wish um, that people who are wondering, who are asking these questions, felt comfortable or had in their lives adults, um, whether it's parents, even though nobody really wants to talk to their parents about their dating life.
Right.
But, an older person in their community or in their church, an aunt or an uncle who made themselves available, um, who actually just sort of gave feedback, even if it's just sort of like, oh, in my day, like this is what dating looked like.
Hmm.
Like, that doesn't seem normal. Are you sure about this? Like, wow, I normally I wouldn't have asked something like this until like X period in time. And I think that's actually a responsibility that older generations really need to take up in full force, in perhaps fuller force than we have before. Nobody wants to be interfering. In America, we're all about sort of individualism and allowing people the freedom to make their own choices and not interfering. Um, but guidance is really important.
That's really difficult to do though on in both directions, because on the one hand, I think with those potential mentors, the question is, I don't just walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, do you want some guidance in terms of love and
Yeah.
intimacy?" So how does one do that? And for younger people who, I hear this all the time, where they would say, "I actually do want a mentor, but I don't know how to." You don't just
Get
walk up to
one.
somebody and say, "Will you mentor me?" And so you kind of, sometimes you'll have, even in the same church or the same neighborhood or somewhere, those potential mentors and potential mentees who both want the same thing, but they don't know how to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I think another thing that, has happened over the past couple of decades is a real generational divide. Um, you know, older like people just sort of hang out with their age slice in some way.
Yeah.
And I feel like one valuable thing um, that for churches or for individuals would just be to like cross those barriers, which isn't necessarily like stepping up to someone and saying, hello, I will be your mentor. But, if they're sort of young people, or people in your community, just like have someone over for dinner. Just like begin to include people in your life. I feel like just living in a city myself, and having, being a young person in a city, having been a young single person in a city, it's lonely.
Mhm.
Um, and simply like being over, at someone's place or being invited to something by an older member of your community is actually a real gift. And that, doesn't even necessarily have to involve sort of like dictating advice to someone about how you date. Simply by being around a functional adult and being like, oh, that's what that looks like.
Yeah.
Interesting. Just being able to observe other people, um, can give you lots of information about the situation you're in. Like,
Mhm.
oh, mine seems a lot more unpleasant than that. Or like there's something going on with me that I don't see in this healthy space, which maybe suggests something to me.
You mentioned smartphones, and it seems to me there's kind of a parallel here because one of the things Jonathan Haidt's been on here a lot talking about this issue of smartphones and anxiety and so forth. And what I found is a lot of people really resonated with what he was saying because up until that point, they had assumed, well, this is just what the world is like now. There's nothing you can do about it. And so, yeah, so it seems almost when you were talking about the way that these these performers in pornography are mistreated and objectified and so forth. Sometimes I feel like when I say that, people's response to it is, yeah, iPhones are put together in who knows what kind of conditions in China. What are you going to do? This is just sort of the world we live in now. And there's kind of a despair and a powerlessness about that.
Mhm.
And I wonder, as we're moving into what I think almost anybody who's paying attention would see as a really, really rapid sort of move into AI and virtual reality and all kinds of technological change. Who knows how much more accessible and immersible this stuff is going to be. How do we combat that sense of just defeat and despair over it?
I think about this a lot,
Mm,
a lot, because I do worry that this problem is only going to get worse as, yeah, porn will become better, or tied to sort of AI that you form emotional connections with, as we're already seeing,
yeah,
to a kind of terrifying extent right now. Um, I think one key thing is something that you're already doing. We've identified this feeling of fatalism and noting that it is a feeling, that many of us are sharing. And the thing is, it is a feeling and it could be changed. I think one of the things that is really exciting about Jonathan Haidt's work, is that he observed how smartphones were sort of part of our lives. And, you know, it's hard to think of a way that we can extract ourselves from them, but we can.
yeah,
And he was like, actually, we could just not give them to kids. We could just not do that.
yeah,
um, and then people stopped doing that
yeah.
in a lot of places. You
And
know,
giving schools, you actually can say you're not bringing your phones into your schools, and you'll have a few parents will call and complain, but you'll have a lot more parents who will be very happy with this.
right,
Maybe they're not the ones calling, but they're actually happy with the results.
right. Like we can put pressure back on these systems. Um, our tech bros may be our tech overlords, but they are not yet the government. In fact,
Yeah,
we can call for regulation on AI. We can, call for spaces that are smartphone and tech free. Um, we will really have to work very hard to press against the tide. But this isn't, fait accompli. I think that actually many of these companies sort of depend on are feeling fatalistic about this.
yeah,
I've noticed this in the way that Sam Altman, who runs OpenAI, and other AI leaders sort of talk about what's going to happen. Like AI is coming, super intelligence is coming, it's just going to change the world. That's just how it is. It's like, that doesn't have to be how it is, actually.
Yeah.
There is no sort of, magical physics of AI that determines that it will, in fact, move forward the way that you say. Um, the rest of us still live here.
Yeah.
The rest of us still have a say. And I think about AI similarly to how I think about the smartphone. When it came out, um, we were just like, oh, smartphones, this is like so cool and great. We'll just like adopt this. We don't even bother thinking about it. Let's just go. And, now a decade plus later, we're just sort of like, oh no, did this actually ruin our society?
Yeah.
Similarly with social media, we just blindly adopted it and we're like, sure, what could go wrong? And now
This will
we
connect the
know.
world together. We'll.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing that's supposed to happen. The Tower of Babel was not a problem. Um, but I worry that we're beginning to do the same thing with AI. Just being like, oh, sure, like, of course this will happen. Don't even think about it. But like, we're at the moment where we should really be thinking about it, where we should really be putting pressure on these companies and each other to think about, like, do we need this? Do we want this? How is this technology going to change the way that we live? And will it be a good change? If it's not a good change, then maybe we don't need to adopt this in so many spaces. Like, what is this technology doing for the human person? Is this changing us in ways that we would like to be changed? If not, then maybe we need to slow our roll. And that means pressuring these companies to slow down, pressuring our governments to think about real regulation instead of blind adoption. And, if you look at just, pornography specifically, just as a small case, recent polling from the American Survey Center, which is actually part of AEI, the think tank where I work, we see that Gen Z is actually more in favor of regulations on porn and porn access, whether it's, age bans as they've adopted in various places and that the Supreme Court actually, said could be legal, than older generations are. So there is like support for pushback against the way that kind of porn has taken over the internet. And I think that's probably because younger people in particular have had this all their lives and they see how it has harmed them. And so if there's like a groundswell of understanding that like, something's kind of off, like we can act on that.
Do you think that these regulations that we're seeing in some states, do they actually work? This sort of age age verification and these kinds of measures, do they measurably work?
It's early to say data wise, like what measurably works looks like. I know that in a number of the states where these age verification laws have been put in place, Pornhub, which is one of the largest streaming sites for porn, has just decided to not provide porn in that state, which to me actually kind of seems like a win.
Yeah.
It suggests that they find this troubling enough that they don't want to have to work around it. And it's certainly true that people can use VPNs or other ways to get around these age verification um, tools, but they're a speed bump, right? They put some friction in between, a kid, a young person getting onto a porn site, and speed bumps are good. Friction does something. Even if, some people move past it, some people sneak around it, some people won't. And I think also that the law is a teacher, right? And by putting in something like an age limitation, by labeling, it makes it clear that this isn't just an innocuous thing. This is something that you should think twice about. This is something that you have to be old enough to watch, or maybe you shouldn't be watching it at all. And even just like kind of seeding the idea that like maybe this is a little bit dangerous, that's important Because right now, we have a discourse that says, no, it's fine. It's great. Like, go ahead, do what you feel. And
Yeah.
that has not helped anyone at all.
One of the things where it seems we have an almost consensus in at least in mainstream American life is that child porn is wrong.
Right.
But often the argument seems to be simply the abuse of the children involved, which is a major reason why it's wrong. But with AI developing in such a way where you could have images constructed that don't actually abuse a real person but produce this kind of child pornography. Do you think we're moving to a time when it will be much more difficult for people to argue for the wrongness of child porn because they'll say, well, it's now a victimless crime? Or is that a step beyond what even the American people, American society would be willing to take?
I would hope that that is a step beyond what the American people are willing to take, but I've already, seen that argument made. Um, and I find it horrifying and scary.
Hmm.
um, I think the one there, it's really hard to find clear studies on pornography because so many of them are sort of motivated, right? Like porn companies want to prove that it's fine. Religious organizations want to prove, that it's bad. Um, or the research is seen as skewed by many readers. But I think that one thing that I think even anecdotally in research can show is that we become habituated to things. You do something enough times and it becomes normal or inoffensive or perhaps part of your own practice. You can train your attraction. You train what you are attracted to. And when I think of even AI generated child porn as being sort of a victimless crime because no real children are involved, like I'm very uncomfortable with saying like, okay, well, it's okay to train yourself
Hmm.
to be into child sexual assault material. Like you can learn to like that and it's fine to be into that as long as you don't take it any further than that because maybe, I mean, uh, some people, many people presumably are continent enough to not take it beyond that, but like think of that society, a society where
Yeah.
so many people are just like, hmm, I'm into,
What do we think of children then?
yeah, like how does that change the way that children are viewed um, in the eyes of people watching this content, even if no real children are involved? How are they
Hmm.
seen? How safely are they seen? I mean, if we think of, how pornography that's violent against women, you know, research shows that young men who watch violent pornography tend to have more misogynistic views towards women, are less likely to intervene in situations where women call for help, are more likely to blame the victim in a rape case. Um, Now imagine that with children. That's horrifying to me.
There are people who I imagine are listening to this and they would say, well, I I agree with you that we don't really like a lot of the results that have come out of the sexual revolution. On the other hand, nobody wants to return to a time when women had very little agency and very little power and all of these really bad dynamics that were present in American life before that. If you were to say, success would look like an American culture's relationship to sex and sexuality and intimacy and love 15 years from now, generally, this would be success in your view in terms of what that would be like. How would you How would you portray that?
I like this question. Um, I like a high note. It's been a pretty heavy conversation
Yeah,
so
it
far.
has.
um, so in my book, in Rethinking Sex, I talk about how consent, is not enough as a sexual ethic. It's important. You should get consent, but it's the floor. It was never meant to be the ceiling. Um, and so my ideal um, ethic for sexual and romantic encounters is willing the good of the other. So valuing the other person's experience, their personhood, as much as you would your own in any encounter, and noting that if this encounter would not be good for them, just not doing it, caring for them in a sense, loving them actually is what that looks like. And when I think about sort of an ideal sexual or romantic landscape a decade from now, I I agree. It's not one in which women have been, put back in the kitchen or women's rights have been revoked. The sexual revolution, the feminist revolution, they happened for a reason. They happened because women did not feel like they were valued and were not valued, and their voices were not heard in the public square. Um, I think the ideal would be a public square in which men and women were valued equally and were seen as having equal human dignity, and in which we were aware of forces that stripped dignity from people, um, either through changing our imaginations, our understandings of the other in ways that made us see them as less than, um, or taking rights away from them and avoiding those, basically. I think that pornography, in the way that it can change people's vision of the other sex, their understanding of the value of the other sex, that is a negative to me. That is the downside. The bigger downside of pornography is that it makes us see other people as less than human. Um, I think that the thing about revolutions, the thing about both the feminist revolution and the sexual revolution, is that they should still both be corrigible. These revolutions didn't appear to just say, okay, it's a free for all now. Like, we're not going to have any morals. We're not going to have any ethics. Um, what they aim to do is find a way to treat women with care, to treat women with value. And I think the ideal situation is one in which we are still continually asking ourselves, how do we treat the other with dignity? Are we treating the other as a person? And are we creating the spaces for and building the real relationships that I think people actually want? People want relationships of love, of closeness, and of trust, and of real intimacy, not fake intimacy, not intimacy informed by the categories of Pornhub, um, but ones in which we see people and value people for who they are. And I don't know, that may seem vague, but that's my ideal positive future.
Makes me think of what the Apostle Paul said about the one flesh union. I declare to you a mystery. It seems to me we're at a time when even sexuality and intimacy is turned into a quantifiable sort of product of neurons firing in a manipulatable sort of direction, and to recover a sense of mystery and glory around what it means to love and to be loved. That would be a good start.
Yeah, that's
Christine
beautiful.
Emba, thanks so much for being with us today. She's the author of Rethinking Sex. You'll want to check that out. Thanks again for being with us.
Thanks for having me.